"We've got a stiffin' here." Those were the first words that crackled over the dispatch radio as Stanford University security guard Stephen Crawford reported his grim discovery right here inside the campus chapel. And now, 50 years later, I stand right outside where Stephen Crawford was when he called in his report that night. Right here in the oldest part of the Stanford University campus, here in Palo Alto, California. This has ministered to the spiritual needs of the campus students for over 120 years. The church was built in 1903 by Jane Stanford in memory of her late husband, and ever since it stood to be among the most prominent non-denominational churches out here on the Wild West Coast. And during its long history, Stanford Memorial Church has been host to countless religious services, one of those being Steve Jobs' funeral back in 2011. This beautiful structure has also served as a location of one of the most disturbing, shocking crimes of all times. Because back in 1974, MEMCHU Church right here was where one young woman had her life taken in the most disturbing of ways. Her name was Arlis Perry. She was only 19 years old. And after only being on campus just a few weeks, she entered MEMCHU Church late one night to enjoy its tranquility and to connect with God. But instead, poor Arlis found herself locked inside with none other than the devil himself. Born on February 22, 1955 in North Dakota, Arlis K. Dykema grew up in the state's capital of Bismarck as the youngest of 3 children. And those who knew Arlis described her as a kind, sweet, and studious young woman with a passionate love for God. And just like her parents, Arlis was a devout Christian who belonged to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, or FCA, in Bismarck. Now this was in addition to another group, an evangelical society for students called Young Life, whose members just didn't study the Bible, but rather they went out and spread the good word of the Lord to others. As author Maury Terry wrote in his book titled The Ultimate Evil, religion seemed to dominate every aspect of Arlis's life, even her own death. And it was her faith that eventually brought Arlis to a young man named Bruce Perry. Now Bruce, he's the kind of guy that would have been considered to have been what people used to call back in the day the all-American boy. Now, Bruce was a handsome, deeply religious young man with a ton of book smarts and a hell of a good athlete to boot. But he was the kind of guy whose picture you'd find in the yearbook with the designation most likely to succeed. He was that guy. We don't know exactly how Bruce and Arlis first met, but they did attend Bismarck High School together. They were also part of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And by the time of his graduation in 1973, the two had fallen madly in love. And for the next year, the sweethearts continued a long-distance relationship as Bruce studied human biology right here at Stanford University, while Arlis finished her high schooling back home in Bismarck. And then, to everyone's surprise, in the summer of 1974, Bruce returned to Bismarck and asked for Arlis's hand in marriage. Arlis's parents, they were a little unsure. They thought their 19-year-old daughter was a bit too young to be married. But then on the other hand, they also saw how happy Arlis and Bruce were, and they decided to support their daughter's decision in moving 1,500 miles away to right here at Stanford. So on August 17th, Arlis Dykema became Arlis Perry, as she was wed to Bruce at the Bismarck Reformed Church. And after a weeks-long honeymoon in a cabin owned by Arlis's parents, the newlyweds packed up their belongings. Full of excitement on starting a new, beautiful life together, they headed out west. Destination, Palo Alto, California. Here at Stanford, the Perrys settled into what used to be the student housing for married couples, right here at the Quinlan High-Rise in Escondido Village. Wasting no time, Arlis quickly found a job as a receptionist at a Palo Alto law firm, and that kept her busy during the day while Bruce attended classes and tutored freshmen in math. Still, despite California's laid-back attitude and beautiful surrounding scenery, young Arlis, well, she had trouble adjusting to her new life here in the Golden State. It was, after all, the first time she had ever left home, North Dakota. And struggling to make new friends, Arlis spent her free time writing letters to her family and friends back home, while exploring the massive Stanford campus, and of course praying regularly at MEMCHU Church. Now, it's not hard to imagine that this beautiful church right here, the main quad of Stanford University, this quickly became Arlis Perry's favorite spot. No matter how lost or overwhelmed the young woman felt in her new home here in California, Arlis could always find peace and comfort inside the walls of MEMCHU Church, and that's exactly what she needed on the evening of October 12, 1974. Arlis seemed to have been feeling pretty restless at the time, and sometime around 11 p.m., the young woman told her husband Bruce that she wanted to take a walk and drop off a batch of letters that she prepared to send home to her family in Bismarck. But not realizing that his wife might need a little time to be by herself or go out and clear her head, Bruce decided to join Arlis on her walk, and for a while, everything was going just fine. The couple had walked and talked, just having a normal conversation. But then, the topic, it drifted to a sore subject. Apparently a disagreement over a car tire that had been losing pressure lately. Arlis and Bruce both felt that the other one should have done something to fix the situation. A silly little thing really, but enough to cause an argument between the two. Annoyed, Arlis suddenly told Bruce that she needed some time alone. She would go to the nearby Memorial Church to pray and to cool off. In turn, Bruce did a 180 and marched back to his place at the couple's home about a half-mile away, Quinlan Hall. But what Bruce Perry didn't know was that this in fact would be the last time that he would see his young bride Arlis alive. It was now way past midnight. Arlis had never returned home. She was out in a town she was unfamiliar with. Unbearable thoughts about what could have happened to his wife hit Bruce in the gut like a sack of bricks, and he knew he had to do something fast. So thinking he would encounter his wife along the way, Bruce left the apartment and began a frantic walk right here towards this church. But once he arrived, Arlis was nowhere to be seen. Confused and increasingly worried, Bruce made his way to the Memorial Church, only to find all the lights off and the doors all locked. After finding no signs of his wife anywhere, Bruce returned to Quinlan Hall. The only explanation that made any sense at all was that Arlis was still upset and simply just kept walking to try to calm herself. Still alone at 3 a.m., a panicked Bruce Perry picked up the telephone and called the campus security, and that's when he reported his wife missing. Even though Bruce had expressed concern that Arlis might have fallen asleep inside the church here, and just maybe had been locked inside by accident. Security guard Stephen Crawford, he reported going inside the church during his nightly rounds, and he found all the doors locked. Crawford then proceeded inside the church during his inspection, and inside he found no one. Absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. All was just perfectly fine and well. Crawford reported back to Charlie Papp, the dispatcher, that everything at Stanford MEMCHU Church was A-OK. Now the security dispatcher, Charlie Papp, he relayed Crawford's finding over to Bruce, indicating that the young woman was probably somewhere blowing off some steam. Bruce should just hit the hay, get some rest. If they had any word from Arlis, they'd be in touch. And indeed they would, because a while later, Stephen Crawford approached the church at around 5:45 a.m. to open it for Sunday services that morning. And that's when he noticed something alarming. This door right here, on the side of the building, was completely hanging wide open. And after inspecting this door, Crawford determined that someone had broken it from the inside. Naturally, the security guard entered the church, fearing that there was probably a robbery, or maybe on a lesser scale, maybe just a fraternity prank. But as he walked closer to the altar, Stephen could tell that nothing had been taken. But wait a second, there was something over by the last of the pews in the church's eastern wing that should not have been there. It was the half-naked body of Arlis Perry. Crawford crassly called in his findings about finding a stiff, where he voiced his assumption to the dispatcher that the deceased was, quote, another overdose. In the last row of pews in the eastern wing of the church, Arlis Perry lay on her back with her head facing towards the altar. Her body was nude from the waist down, and her jeans were purposely arranged on top of her shins in a diamond-like pattern. From between Arlis's spread legs stuck out an altar candle that had been forced into her. Another candle had been pushed between her breasts, under her ripped bra and crossed arms. The young woman had been clearly beaten, choked, based on the markings all over her body. But what had actually killed Arlis was the ice pick lodged in the back of her skull, right behind her left ear. Several feet away from Arlis's body lay a semen-stained kneeling pillow, which at the time wasn't considered a major piece of evidence, primarily because DNA testing that wouldn't become available pretty much until the mid-'80s. And the only usable print at the crime scene was one, a handprint left on one of the candlesticks. Surprisingly, none of this evidence matched Arlis Perry. And needless to say, such a brutal murder shocked investigators and the public alike. Reverend Robert Hammerton Kelly, who oversaw MEMCHU Church back in the day, as well as oversaw Arlis's body after the crime, described the beating as ritualistic and satanic. What type of monster could have killed such a sweet young 19-year-old girl in the middle of prayer, in the house of God, of all places? Understandably, Arlis's husband, Bruce was suspect number one, and as the church was cordoned off as a crime scene, detectives beat feet directly over the Perry residence at Quinlan Hall. That's where they found Bruce Perry literally covered in blood. Well, this was very shocking to the detectives, and they were very close to arresting Bruce. But the distraught young man then explained that the blood was, in fact, his own. Apparently, Bruce was prone to nosebleeds when he became anxious or distressed. And now with his wife missing, This often caused nosebleeds for him. Now, obviously, this wasn't a good look for someone married to a person who was just brutally murdered. And the police, well, they were a tad suspicious. But in the end, the test proved that Bruce did not kill Arlis. And on top of that, Bruce actually passed the polygraph test, which back in the day, the police relied more heavily on, and they let him go free. While we know today that polygraphs can be inaccurate, back in the day, some agencies relied very heavily on the results of those tests. Now, Stephen Crawford, the security guard, well, he was of course high on the list of persons of interest as well. He told the police that he was running late during his rounds that night, but when he arrived at the church just a little after midnight, he entered Memorial Church and saw nobody there. He announced that the church was closing and pretty much locked up for the night. And after a quick once-over and seeing no one inside, Stephen proceeded to lock the church doors, most likely trapping Arlis inside, alone with her killer. Now, it's important to point out 2 other parishioners had been in the church as well that night, and they had witnessed Arlis make her way to the row of pews on the left-hand side at around 11:35. There she kneeled and began to pray. And according to the witnesses, Arlis remained deeply engaged in prayers as they departed around midnight, coinciding with the church's closing time. Now, Crawford, he also claimed that around 2 a.m., he came back for another sweep around campus. And he also walked through Memorial Church, the room called the Round Room in the back. And once again, he determined that no one was inside the building. He checked the doors and made sure that they were all locked. Now, depending how accurate his report is, Crawford's inspection of the church must not have been very thorough, because by that time, Arlis Perry, well, she was already lying dead on the floor. Also, the side door had not yet been forced open from the inside, meaning that the killer must still have been inside with his victim. And even if the detectives were suspicious of Stephen Crawford's story, there wasn't really any evidence linking the watchman to the brutal murder. Now, the forensic team, they found a palm print on one of the candlesticks, but neither print matched Stephen or Bruce. Now, with little evidence to go on, the police needed to focus on establishing other facts of the case, specifically finding the motive. Now, while the investigators believed that Arlis Perry's murder was simply a sexual psychopath who saw his opportunity and followed the young woman into church, there were rumors that spread about the brutal killing being connected to a satanic group. It just wasn't that Arlis had been killed inside a church. And not long after Arlis's death, a rumor began to build about how the young woman had once tried to convert cult members to Christianity back in her home state of North Dakota. And that's when people began to think perhaps, just maybe, those people were somehow connected. They were so enraged by Arlis's actions that they tracked her down all the way to California and slaughtered her inside the Stanford Memorial Church, desecrating her religion in the house of the Lord. Now, this theory might sound far-fetched, but some actually believe that the speculations were confirmed 5 years after Arlis's death by none other than serial killer David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam. In 1979, all the way over on the East Coast, David Berkowitz, he had confessed to killing 6 people and wounding several others in a series of so-called Son of Sam murders that took place in the streets of New York City. In his arrest, Berkowitz claimed that he'd been following the direct orders of a demon that had been manifested inside of a black Labrador named Harvey. And this dog, well, the dog just happened to belong to Berkowitz's neighbor, Sam Carr, thus the Son of Sam. Later, however, Berkowitz told author Maury Perry that he was in fact part of a nationwide satanic cult, and that he wanted to spread chaos throughout the world by killing people. This was the very same cult that Berkowitz claimed was responsible for the death of Arlis Perry, here at Stanford Memorial Church. David Berkowitz then sent a book titled The Anatomy of Witchcraft to Deputy Sheriff Terry Gardner in Ward County, North Dakota, with the following message written in the margins: Arlis Perry, hunted, stalked, and slain, followed to California and Stanford University. Now, this is several years after the death of Arlis Perry, and unfortunately for the cops, their leads had all but dried up. But honestly, could it be realistic that someone had actually followed the young woman all the way from North Dakota to California to sacrifice her here in a satanic ritual? Berkowitz then upped the ante when he claimed he knew the identity of Arlis's killer, that this person had actually in fact attended a cult meeting in Queens where Berkowitz lived. And apparently this person blabbed to everyone there that he was the person who murdered the poor girl in Stanford Memorial Church. But when Detective Ken Kahn went to interview Berkowitz in prison, Berkowitz refused to talk, giving the authorities the impression that the killer of 6 simply enjoyed getting the attention. The officers could quickly tell that the cult connection to Arlis's murder was leading nowhere. And after another dead end, the Arlis Perry murder case officially went cold. Years passed, decades even. They slowly rolled by, with no further progress in the case. But all that suddenly changed in 2018, 44 years after the young woman's had been discovered inside. That's when the cold case detectives received incredible news. A suspect had been linked to Arlis's murder, thanks to a DNA sample on the young woman's genes. But just who was that suspect? Apparently, the authorities had Stephen Crawford's DNA profile in their database for a number of years, but it took more advanced technology to finally match the DNA code with a marking on Arlis Perry's pant leg. And this exciting development was more than enough evidence to obtain a warrant to search Stephen Crawford's home. Tragically, neither the authorities nor Arlis's family would ever get to ask Stephen Crawford the one question that had been keeping them up at night for the past 45 years. Why? Because at 9:04 a.m. on June 28, 2018, deputies from the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office approached Stephen Crawford's front door right here to serve him a search warrant. But as they entered the apartment, the police found Crawford sitting on the bed, gun in hand. And only a short time after backing away from the apartment, the deputies heard a single shot. It was in that moment that the police knew that Stephen Crawford had chosen to kill himself, rather than to face his own brutal new reality and consequences. Inside the apartment right here, investigators found a shocking piece of evidence. It was the jacket cover of author Maury Terry's book, The Ultimate Evil, a book that theorizes that the Berkowitz's Son of Sam killings were indeed connected to a cult. And on the back side of the book jacket, Crawford had scrawled a suicide note dated 2016, the same year when the detectives started to re-interrogate him for the Stanford Chapel murders. And although the note didn't mention Arlis's murder directly, Stephen Crawford's action when the police were closing in seemed to send a very clear message about his guilt. But that wasn't all the authorities learned. Apparently, Stephen had once worked as a police officer at the Stanford Department of Public Safety, but after a new chief decided that all the officers had to reapply to be qualified to carry a handgun in 1972, Stephen Crawford lost his job. But as an alternative, he was given a lower-paying job as a security guard on the campus. And apparently, this arrangement completely pissed off Crawford to high heaven. And in the following years, it was reported that he constantly complained about this unfair treatment by the school. But despite all the complaining, Crawford worked as a Stanford security guard into the 90s, when his luck eventually ran out. Because that was when Stephen Crawford got caught for stealing valuables from Stanford University. Apparently, he even stole a blank diploma, took it to a print shop, and instantly had himself a doctorate degree. What a guy! And sure, stealing a diploma and claiming to be a lawyer or a doctor while thousands of other kids have to go and study their asses off and fork over tons and tons of cash for the tuition, well, let's be honest, that's a real shitbag move. But does it mean Crawford was a murderer? I mean, was he really that angry at the university that he killed Arlis Perry as an act of revenge? Well, the authorities seem to believe so. But still, there are some people who think the police got the wrong guy. In the police body cam footage, while attempting to serve the warrant to Stephen Crawford, Crawford could be heard in the background speaking his last words in a sorrowful tone. He stated, quote, "Why are you doing this to me?" End quote. Now that's a rather odd question for a man who never seemed to be able to outrun his association with the case, or from being hounded by the authorities. And later some speculated that those were not actually Stephen Crawford's last words, but rather the final words of Arlis Perry. And in doing my research for this episode here, this story, I found it very interesting that on the night of Arlis Perry's murder, that when local police arrived on the murder scene, that Stephen Crawford was nowhere to be found. Now, the crazy thing is Crawford apparently left the crime scene and went home on the night of Arlis's murder before the other police arrived. And anyone knows that's a huge no-no, especially for someone who just reported a murder. Now, the DNA evidence shows that Crawford was present on the night of Arlis Perry's murder, but did he act alone? And was the former security guard a serial killer responsible for other murders around the Palo Alto area? Now, the authorities have been wondering the same thing. Now, it's important to point out that Arlis Perry was only one of 3 murders that took place on, close to, the campus here at Stanford between 1973 and 1974, a series of grisly events that became to be known as the Stanford murders. But because Crawford was not found to be the killer of the other 2 female victims, and we'll explore that in a different episode. But as for the Arlis Perry murder, her case was finally declared solved by the Sheriff's Department in 2018, thanks to supporting DNA evidence. And while Stephen Crawford was always the prime suspect, not all are fully convinced of the former security guard's guilt, despite the strong evidence. Some, including some of the original detectives on the case, remain skeptical, believing that Crawford, quote, just didn't have it in him. He didn't have the wherewithal to commit murder, especially here at Stanford. But unfortunately, we will never know. Not after Stephen Crawford took all the answers that he might have had. He took them to his grave, making this story another grim reminder that even in the most somber and holiest of places, it's always a good idea to stay alert, keep an eye out, especially out here on this wicked West Coast, in this Bay Area Babylon we live in.